Do you have a passion for the unexplained? Do tales of ghosts, legends, and things that go bump in the night captivate you? Then join our community of mystery seekers. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the shadows. Dare you listen closely? It was a stiflingly hot summer in my hometown, a quiet, unremarkable suburb perched on the very edge of a sprawling metropolis. Desperate for a bit of spending money and eager to secure my first real taste of independence, I took a job at a local, family-owned pizza parlor. At the very beginning, my responsibilities were safely confined to the stifling, fluorescent-lit back room of the restaurant. They had me stationed as an assistant to the head chef, meaning my evenings were spent entirely in the kitchen. I washed mountains of greasy dishes, scrubbed the heavy iron pizza pans until my knuckles bled, prepped endless vats of dough, and swept up the flour that coated the floor like a fine layer of gray snow. It was exhausting, tedious, and completely unglamorous work, but I was young and happy to simply be earning my own paycheck. This predictable routine lasted for about 2 months. Eventually, my boss pulled me aside and offered what I naively believed was a massive promotion. He explained that on the main delivery boy's days off, he needed someone reliable to cover the routes. He wanted me to step up and handle the deliveries. I agreed immediately. Getting out of that sweltering kitchen, cruising around town in my own car with the windows down, listening to music, and pocketing cash tips felt like an absolute dream come true. But then, the atmosphere in the parlor abruptly shifted. Out of nowhere, our main delivery boy quit. I will never forget the evening it happened. He had just returned from what was supposed to be a standard, routine run. When he pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant, he didn't look like a teenager who had just dropped off a large pepperoni pizza. He looked utterly hollowed out. He was physically shaking, his face drained of all color, entirely pale and sickly. But it was his eyes that truly unnerved me. They were wide, darting frantically around the room, dilated and completely stripped of their usual youthful arrogance. He looked like someone who had just barely survived a terrible accident. Without saying a single word to any of the rest of us, he marched straight into the boss's cramped back office and slammed the door behind him. For the next 15 minutes, we could hear the muffled, frantic sounds of a heated argument bleeding through the thin walls. When the door finally swung open again, the delivery boy walked out, looking exhausted and resigned. He paused beside me, placed a trembling hand on my shoulder, and muttered, "Good luck, kid." When I asked him what was going on, why he was leaving so suddenly, he simply refused to look me in the eye. He stared at the floor, forced a hollow laugh, and mumbled that it was just a terrible, low-paying job, and he was entirely sick of it. He patted me on the back one last time and walked out into the night. I never saw him again. Even then, standing in the flour-dusted kitchen, a cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew, with absolute certainty, that he was lying. You don't look like a hunted animal just because you are tired of delivering food. Something had deeply horrified him, but I was too young and too foolish to press the issue. I brushed it off, convincing myself that he was just being dramatic. With him permanently gone, I became the primary delivery boy by default, at least until management could find a suitable replacement. For the first 2 weeks, the job was exactly what I had hoped for. The tips were decent, the driving was relaxing, and I felt a newfound sense of freedom. I was lulled into a false sense of security, completely unaware that the clock was ticking down to my own nightmare. It happened on a Tuesday evening. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. My boss handed me a fresh slip of paper with an address scribbled across it, shoved a hot pizza box into my hands, and told me to make it quick. As was my habit, I punched the address into my phone's GPS, climbed into my car, and began the drive. I genuinely hoped it would be a fast, 2-minute turnaround so I could finally clock out and go home to my bed. However, as the automated voice on my phone guided me further and further away from the comforting neon lights of the commercial district, my creeping unease began to grow. The route was pulling me out toward the extreme rural outskirts of the town, a desolate area where the paved suburban roads slowly gave way to cracked, neglected asphalt and eventually loose dirt. Out here, there were no streetlights. The houses were spaced at least a quarter of a mile apart, separated by dense, suffocating expanses of overgrown woods and empty, silent fields. The further I drove, the heavier the atmosphere became, as if the air itself was thickening. warning me to turn around. Finally, my headlights swept across a decaying mailbox, and the GPS chirped, announcing my arrival. I put the car in park and sat idling at the edge of the property, just staring through my dusty windshield. The house sitting at the end of the long, unpaved driveway was a two-story structure that looked like it had been violently pulled straight out of a gothic horror novel. It was surrounded by towering, dead trees, their leafless branches clawing desperately at the darkening sky like skeletal fingers. The lawn was an overgrown jungle of brown, dying weeds that reached as high as my knees. The structure itself was a decaying, rotting corpse of a home. The paint was peeling away in massive, diseased scabs. The sprawling wooden porch was completely empty. There were no chairs, no tables, no flower pots, no welcoming signs of human life. It was entirely barren. It looked abandoned. It felt abandoned. Every single biological instinct I possessed was screaming at me to throw the car into reverse, speed back to the safety of the restaurant, and tell my boss that the address was a fake. But the foolish, obedient employee inside me reasoned that I had a job to do. I swallowed the thick lump of pure dread lodging in my throat, turned off the engine, grabbed the cardboard box, and stepped out into the oppressive silence of the rural evening. The crunch of the gravel beneath my sneakers sounded deafeningly loud, like gunshots in the quiet air. I walked slowly up to the porch, the old wooden steps groaning an agonizing protest beneath my weight. I knocked on the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing hollowly inside the dark interior. I stood there, praying to a god I barely believed in that my boss had simply written down the wrong street name, hoping I could just leave and forget this entire eerie experience. Instead, the rusted metal lock began to rattle. The doorknob turned with a painfully slow, grinding screech, and the heavy door groaned inward, revealing the pitch-black hallway within. Standing in the threshold was an elderly woman. She had to be at least 70 years old, perhaps much older. Her hair was a wild, unkempt mane of thinning white strands that framed a deeply wrinkled, hollowed-out face. She was incredibly short, practically hunched over, and when she opened her mouth slightly, I could see that several of her rotting teeth were entirely missing. But it was not her physical frailty that paralyzed me. It was her eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and devoid of any human warmth. They were glaring at me, with an intensity that felt completely predatory. She didn't look like a hungry customer waiting for dinner. She looked like a spider watching a fly become hopelessly entangled in its web. I desperately tried to project a sense of calm, plastering a fake, trembling smile onto my face, figuring that, if I remained perfectly polite, the transaction would end quickly. "Pepperoni pizza, ma'am," I managed to say, my voice pitching up an octave higher than usual as I tried to sound friendly. "Yes," she replied. Her voice was entirely inhuman. It was a guttural, wet, hoarse rasp, sounding exactly like someone speaking through a throat full of crushed glass. "Alrighty, here you go," I said, hastily extending the warm cardboard box toward her chest, desperate to bridge the gap and end the interaction. But she didn't reach for it. She didn't move her arms at all. She simply stood there, an immovable statue in the doorway, her dead eyes locked onto mine with absolutely zero emotion. She completely ignored the food. Instead, she slowly lowered one hand into the deep, dark opening of a weathered leather purse slung over her shoulder. As she rummaged around inside, she tilted her head slightly and asked a question that caused the blood to instantly freeze in my veins. "Did you come with someone else?" I froze entirely. My breath hitched in my chest. I quickly looked up from the purse to meet her unyielding, glaring stare. The sheer abnormality of the question, asked out here in the absolute middle of nowhere, sent a shockwave of primal panic straight into my core. "No," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "Where is the other one?" she demanded, her hoarse voice dropping into an angry, accusatory growl. "He went off on me the last time he came here. He ran off." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The traumatized look on the previous delivery boy's face, his frantic resignation, his total refusal to explain what had happened. This was the house. She was the reason he had quit. He quit a few weeks ago, I managed to say, my legs beginning to tremble uncontrollably beneath me. She absorbed this information in total silence. Then, she resumed digging through her purse. She searched for what felt like an absolute eternity. It was the longest, most agonizing minute of my entire life. I stood entirely exposed on that rotting porch, holding a rapidly cooling pizza, watching her arm move methodically inside the leather bag. Suddenly, her hand stopped moving. She kept her right hand firmly buried inside the purse, gripping something unseen. She looked up at me again. This time, there was no confusion in her expression. There was no innocent realization that she had forgotten her wallet. It was a look of cold, calculating intent. I could see the muscles in her forearm tensing. She was gripping something heavy inside that bag. My mind began racing through horrifying possibilities. What could possibly be taking her so long to pull out a simple $10 bill? Was she gripping a canister of pepper spray? A heavy kitchen knife? A loaded firearm? Before I could process the rising panic, my peripheral vision caught a sudden movement. Deep inside the black void of the house, directly behind the old woman, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was the massive, hulking silhouette of a tall man moving silently down the hallway, making a direct, purposeful line straight toward the open front door. At that exact same second, the terrifying illusion of isolation was shattered completely. To my immediate left, just around the side of the overgrown porch, the heavy, unmistakable sound of heavy work boots violently crushing dead leaves shattered the silence. A deep, aggressive male voice barked out from the darkness. "Hey!" I violently whipped my head to the left. Rising up from the shadows beside the stairs was the head and shoulders of a large, middle-aged man. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His eyes locked onto me like a target, and without a second of hesitation, he lunged forward, his massive hands grabbing the wooden railing as he began to violently hoist himself over the side of the porch, cutting off my only path to the stairs. The trap had been perfectly sprung. The old woman keeping me occupied, the man in the hallway blocking the exit, and the man outside cutting off my escape. Pure, unthinking survival instinct instantly overrode my paralyzing fear. I didn't think, I simply reacted. I dropped the pizza box right onto the rotting wooden planks, spun around on my heels, and launched myself off the opposite edge of the porch, tumbling directly into the overgrown, knee-high weeds. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape a cage. I sprinted toward my car with a speed I didn't know my body possessed. I didn't look back to see if they were chasing me. I didn't care. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the heavy metal door shut, violently jammed the key into the ignition, and threw the car into drive. I stomped the gas pedal all the way to the floorboards, the tires shrieking and spitting gravel as I tore out of that cursed driveway, speeding blindly back into the safety of the dark road. I drove for miles, my entire body shaking so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. When I finally made it back to the pizza parlor, I was a wreck. I lied to my boss, claiming I had accidentally dropped the pizza on the ground and paid for the ruined food out of my own meager pocket just to avoid having to explain the horrifying truth of what had actually occurred. It wasn't until the very day I finally gathered the courage to quit that I confessed the entire dreadful story to my boss. When I finished speaking, his face drained of color. He looked at me with the exact same horrified realization I had felt on that porch. He told me that the previous driver had said the exact same thing, that he had simply walked up to the house, gotten a terrible, terrifying feeling, dropped the food, and run for his life. My boss immediately called the local police department to report the deeply sketchy situation. 2 agonizing days later, he called me at home to share what the authorities had uncovered. The police had looked into the property records. That decaying house in the woods wasn't a home. It was completely abandoned. It had been legally foreclosed upon and sitting totally empty for well over a year. When the officers finally broke through the front door, they didn't find a sweet old woman living alone. They found 3 dangerous, transient squatters illegally living inside the rotting walls, 2 aggressively violent adult men, and the creepy, dead-eyed old woman I had encountered on the porch. The police arrested all 3 of them on the spot. My boss didn't have any further details to share about what they found inside that house, or what those 3 individuals had been planning to do with a naive, isolated delivery driver standing on their doorstep. Four years ago, during the suffocating end of my senior year in high school, I worked a dead-end job that paid just enough to keep my 1999 Camry running. The car was a dependable piece of metal, smelling permanently of stale cardboard, grease, and cheap pepperoni. It was the perfect vessel for delivering pizzas, an isolated little bubble that carried me through the lonely roads of upstate New York. I lived deep in the country, the kind of place where civilization bled away into vast, unbroken stretches of towering pines and nameless dirt roads. Out there, every delivery was a long haul. It was my final delivery of the shift. The sun had already begun its descent, bleeding bruised shades of purple and burnt orange across the horizon. It was around 7 in the evening, that liminal hour when the daylight surrendered to the encroaching shadows. I punched the address into the GPS on my phone, setting it in the cup holder. The blue light of the screen cast a pale, ghostly glow across my face as I navigated away from the safety of the neon-lit pizzeria and into the darkening rural landscape. The further I drove, the more the world seemed to narrow. The paved roads eventually surrendered to packed dirt and loose earth. The dense canopy of ancient trees closed in on either side of the narrow lane, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of branches that scraped and clawed at the fading sky above. The radio signal had faded miles ago, leaving only the relentless hum of the engine and the rolling of tires against the rugged ground. I was alone, miles from another human soul, diving deeper into the forested abyss. The GPS told me I had 15 minutes left. 15 minutes of descending into the absolute quiet of the woods. When the mechanical voice of the navigation app finally announced my arrival, the last dregs of sunlight had vanished, leaving the world bathed in heavy, oppressive twilight. I pulled the Camry to a halt, shifting into park and left the headlights cutting a harsh yellow cone through the gloom. There were no streetlights out here. No neighboring houses. No ambient glow of a distant town. There was only the house. It sat at the end of a long, invisible driveway, a small, rotting cottage made entirely of weathered wood. It looked less like a home and more like a decaying mushroom that had sprouted from the damp earth. The structure sagged under the weight of its own neglect, surrounded by an impenetrable wall of forest on all sides. The lawn was a wild, untamed sea of dying weeds and overgrown grass that reached nearly to my knees. It had clearly been abandoned to the elements for seasons, if not years. I sat in the car for a moment, the engine idling, feeling a cold knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. Deliveries to rundown trailers and isolated farmhouses were a regular part of the job out here, so the isolation itself wasn't entirely new. But there was a heavy, stagnant quality to the air around this property, a profound wrongness that I couldn't articulate. Still, I grabbed the cardboard box from the passenger seat, the heat of it radiating through the cardboard, and pushed the driver's side door open. The night air was unnaturally still and bitter cold. I waded through the overgrown grass, the damp stalks dragging heavily against my jeans, leaving dark, wet streaks across the denim. The porch was a collection of splintered planks that groaned in agonizing protest beneath my weight. There was no porch light, no illuminated windows, no sign of life from within, just the absolute suffocating darkness. I searched the doorframe for a bell, but found nothing. Steeling myself, I raised a fist and knocked firmly against the heavy wooden door. The noise echoed violently into the silent woods behind me, a loud, intrusive declaration of my presence. Then, I waited. 10 seconds passed. Nothing. I was about to turn around, hoping to claim nobody was home, when the movement began. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, pressing against the interior floorboards. They were slow, almost rhythmic, dragging closer to the door. The footsteps reached the other side of the threshold and simply stopped. Silence returned, thicker and more menacing than before. I stared at the peeling paint of the door, a sudden, primal instinct screaming at me to run. I felt the undeniable, skin-prickling sensation of being watched. My eyes drifted upward, settling on a small, darkened peephole embedded in the wood. It looked like a dead, hollow eye staring back at me from the abyss. "It's the pizza guy," I called out, my voice trembling slightly, entirely lacking the confident customer service tone I usually maintained. A moment of agonizing silence followed. Then, a voice bled through the wood. It was low, harsh, and grating, like the sound of dry leaves scraping across concrete. "Bring the pizza out back." The sheer wrongness of the command hit me like a physical blow. Delivering to a dark, isolated house was one thing, but wandering into the unseen, unlit backyard of a stranger's property at night was entirely another. Every alarm bell in my head was ringing. "Are you sure, sir?" I called back, clutching the pizza box tightly against my chest like a fragile shield. No response. The heavy presence on the other side of the door remained motionless. I knew they were still looking at me through the tiny glass lens. I could almost feel their gaze burning into my skin. I took a half step backward, my body begging me to retreat to the safety of my idling car, to throw it into reverse and tear out of the dirt road as fast as the engine would carry me. But the mundane, grounded reality of my life yanked me back. I needed this job. The last time a customer refused to answer and I brought a cold pizza back to the store, my manager had threatened to fire me, screaming about wasted inventory and my lack of effort. I couldn't afford to lose my meager income over an irrational bout of paranoia. Swallowing the lump of terror in my throat, I nodded to nobody in particular. I turned away from the door and began to navigate the perimeter of the decaying cottage. The side of the house was entirely swallowed by shadows. The overgrown grass was even thicker here, concealing the uneven, treacherous ground beneath my feet. I moved slowly, the cardboard box awkward in my hands, my eyes straining to pierce the suffocating darkness. As I rounded the back corner of the structure, the layout of the backyard slowly materialized in the gloom. It was a desolate expanse. A dilapidated shed leaned precariously against the tree line, its door hanging off rusted hinges. Nearer to the house sat a small, rotting wooden patio. Upon the patio rested a circular table, surrounded by 4 mismatched chairs. My breath caught in my throat. In one of those chairs, sitting rigidly and facing the dark expanse of the woods, was a figure. I could only see the back of a head and the sharp, stiff lines of their shoulders. They were completely motionless, as still as a statue carved from the night itself. The temperature in the air seemed to plummet, freezing the blood in my veins. My rational mind tried to supply an explanation. It was just a customer, waiting in the cool night air for their food. But my instincts knew better. There was a profound, terrifying unnaturalness to the way they sat. Not a single breath seemed to disturb their posture. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was little more than a whisper, fragile and wavering. The figure did not move. Not a fraction of an inch. Not a flinch. Not a turn of the head. I forced myself to take a hesitant step closer, the damp grass clinging to my ankles. The silence of the woods was absolute, pressing against my eardrums. "Excuse me," I said again, forcing more volume from my lungs. "I have your delivery." Still, the figure remained completely paralyzed. A sickening dread pooled in the pit of my stomach. Then, a voice shattered the silence. "Over here." The voice did not come from the figure in the chair. It came from directly behind me. A surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded my system. I spun around, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. There, protruding from the sharp corner of the house I had just passed, was a face. A man was poking his head around the rotting wooden siding. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely devoid of sanity. But it was his smile that paralyzed me. It was a crazed, impossible grin, stretching his lips far beyond their natural limits, exposing a flash of teeth in the dim light. He looked entirely unhinged, an apex predator revealing itself from the camouflage of the night. "Come over here," the man whispered, his voice dripping with a sickly, eager malice. "I want to show you something." The world tilted on its axis. Rational thought completely evaporated, replaced by the sheer, blinding instinct of survival. I didn't speak. I simply turned and ran. I scrambled away from the patio, abandoning the path I had taken, and charged blindly around the opposite side of the house. I tore through the knee-high weeds, the hidden debris of the yard catching at my shins. I didn't look back. I expected to feel hands grasping at my collar, pulling me down into the damp earth, but I just kept running. Somehow, in the blind panic of my flight, my fingers remained locked in a death grip around the pizza box. I burst from the tree line and saw the beautiful, harsh yellow beams of the Camry's headlights illuminating the overgrown driveway. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and pressed my thumb into the lock button. The engine roared to life as I threw the car into drive, my foot burying the gas pedal. The tires spun wildly, throwing dirt into the air before finding traction and launching the car forward. I drove with reckless abandon, flying down the winding, pitch-black dirt roads, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see a pair of headlights pursuing me in the dark. It wasn't until I reached the paved highway, bathed in the faint glow of the moon, that I finally pulled over to the shoulder. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely retrieve my phone from my pocket. I dialed the police. I sat there in the idling car, the smell of the cold pizza filling the cabin, stammering out a frantic explanation to the dispatcher. I gave them the address and waited by the side of the highway until a patrol car met me. Later that night, the officers informed me of their findings. They had investigated the property, swept the house, the shed, and the overgrown yard. The place was entirely abandoned. The doors were nailed shut from the inside. The floorboards were covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. According to the police, there was absolutely no sign of anyone having lived in that house for a very long time. I never went back to the pizzeria. I quit my job the very next morning, handing over my uniform without a word of explanation. 4 years have passed since that night. I still live out in the country, but I never drive down those deeply forested roads after sunset. The air in central Ohio has a specific heavy chill that seems to settle deep into your marrow long after the sun goes down. I lived in a sprawling city there, one that begins with a C, famously dominated by a massive university campus that pulses with life day and night. But my life was far less glamorous. I attended a different, much smaller college about a 20-minute drive away from the city center, and to keep myself afloat, I spent my nights working as a delivery driver for a local pizza joint. My territory covered the bustling city streets and bled outward into the quieter, darker surrounding suburbs. You learn a lot about a place when you navigate it in the dead of night. You learn which neighborhoods to avoid, which poorly lit streets hide deep potholes, and you learn the exact rhythm of the midnight hours. But there is one specific window of time that every delivery driver universally dreads. My coworkers and I referred to it simply as the dead hour. It was that agonizing final stretch just before the shop closed at 1 in the morning. By then, the ovens were cooling, the floors were being swept, the smell of stale grease hung heavy in the air, and all you wanted to do was strip off your flour-dusted uniform and collapse into bed. Naturally, it was during the dead hour that the phone rang. The tinny ringtone echoed through the near-empty shop, a sound that immediately sent a wave of resentment through my exhausted body. I begrudgingly took the order. It was a delivery designated for the town where my own, smaller college was located, a suburban city situated just northwest of my home base. I grabbed the cardboard boxes, their heat seeping through the cheap cardboard into my hands, and trudged out to my car. Sliding into the driver's seat, I plugged the address into my GPS. The blue glow of the screen illuminated the dark cabin of my car, mapping out a route that immediately made my stomach tighten. The destination wasn't in a familiar subdivision or a well-lit apartment complex. The pin dropped squarely off a winding back road, situated in a sparsely populated, heavily wooded area that bordered the edge of the county. I stared at the screen for a moment, an unexplainable knot forming in my throat, but I brushed the feeling aside. I was tired, I was irritable, and I just wanted to get this over with. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove up Route 315, merging onto Interstate 270 East. At this hour, the highway was a desolate ribbon of concrete. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, rhythmic shadows across the dashboard. I exited the interstate, leaving the comforting glow of downtown behind me. My route took me past the sprawling local cemetery, acres of pale headstones standing silently in the dark, and right past the sleeping campus of the college. Slowly, the environment began to change. The densely packed neighborhoods gave way to older, quieter subdevelopments. The streetlights became fewer and further between, until they disappeared completely. The paved roads transitioned into rougher asphalt, the dense tree lines pressing in close on both sides of my car like walls closing in. The darkness out here was absolute, thick and oppressive, broken only by the twin beams of my headlights cutting through the night. Finally, the mechanical voice of the GPS broke the silence of my car, announcing that I had arrived at my destination. I slowed the vehicle to a crawl, peering through the windshield into the gloom. My headlights washed over the property, and the knot in my stomach immediately twisted into a cold, hard knot of pure dread. The house, sitting at the end of the overgrown gravel driveway, was entirely boarded up. Thick, rotting planks of wood were nailed haphazardly over every single window and door. The paint was peeling in long, sickly strips, and the front porch was sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. The place was a tomb. It was completely abandoned, devoid of any signs of life. The silence outside was deafening, the kind of quiet that feels heavy against your eardrums. Every single instinct in my body, every primal alarm bell in my head, was screaming at me to put the car in reverse and get the hell out of there. But the rational, modern part of my brain argued back. My boss was a notoriously hard-ass manager who scrutinized every voided ticket and undelivered order. If I drove back to the shop with these pizzas simply because I got spooked by an old house, he would be furious. He would probably fire me on the spot. And I desperately needed this job to pay my tuition. Trying to swallow the rising panic, I put the car in park and left the engine idling. I grabbed the pizza boxes and stepped out into the freezing night air. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights, I noticed something else. Tucked far back into the overgrown weeds behind the rotting husk of the main house, there was a dilapidated wooden shed. It was small, heavily weathered, and partially obscured by the twisting branches of dead bushes. And there, shining through a single grimy square of glass, was a light. It wasn't the steady, comforting glow of an incandescent bulb. It was a sickly, erratic flickering, like a dying candle or a weak lantern fighting against the dark. I took a deep breath, clutching the warm cardboard boxes to my chest like a shield, and forced myself to walk away from the safety of my idling car. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my shoes, the sound echoing far too loudly in the stillness. I hated how exposed I felt. I kept my eyes locked on that flickering light in the shed window, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I was about halfway up the driveway, nearing the edge of the sprawling, overgrown bushes that separated the yard from the shed, when the silence was suddenly shattered. It started as a harsh, violent rustling in the dense brush directly to my right. It wasn't a raccoon or a stray dog. The movement was too heavy, too deliberate. I froze in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat, the blood turning to ice in my veins. I strained my eyes against the impenetrable shadows of the bushes, praying my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, from the absolute blackness of the thicket, a man's voice whispered. It was low, raspy, and carried a sick, eager anticipation that made my skin crawl. "Here they come, Billy. 45. 45. Before my brain could even process the cryptic, terrifying words, the shadows violently detached themselves from the darkness. A man lunged out of the dense bushes, bursting into the periphery of my vision. At the exact same second, the door of the decaying shed was violently kicked open. 2 more figures poured out from the structure, sprinting directly toward me. My mind struggled to comprehend the nightmare unfolding in front of my eyes. All 3 of the men were dressed in long, flowing, dark robes that dragged against the weeds. But it was their faces that will be permanently burned into my memory. They were wearing blank, featureless white masks. The pale visages gleamed unnaturally in the moonlight, devoid of human emotion, completely blank and soulless. And in their hands, catching the faint glint of my car's distant headlights, were long, jagged knives. Pure, unadulterated terror seized my body. The survival instinct took over with violent force. I didn't think. I just threw the stack of pizzas directly at the masked figure, charging from the bushes, and spun on my heel. I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my entire life. The gravel slipped beneath my feet, but I caught my balance, my legs pumping desperately as I sprinted back toward the idling car. I could hear them right behind me. I could hear the heavy, frantic thud of their boots on the ground, the rustling of their robes, the ragged sound of their breathing closing the distance. They were impossibly fast. I reached the driver's side door and threw it open, practically hurling my body into the cabin. As I frantically pulled the door shut, one of the assailants reached me. He lunged forward, his masked face appearing briefly in the window frame, a hollow white void staring directly into my eyes. He thrust his weapon through the closing gap. I felt a sharp, burning tear across my forearm as the blade sliced through my jacket and grazed my skin. I slammed the door completely shut, locking it instantly, and threw the car into drive. My foot slammed the gas pedal all the way to the floorboards. The tires spun wildly, violently kicking up a storm of gravel and dirt before finally catching traction. The car launched forward, tearing out of the driveway and careening wildly onto the narrow blacktop of the back road. My heart was beating so fiercely I could feel it in my teeth. My arm stung fiercely, warm blood dampening the fabric of my sleeve, but the pain was entirely eclipsed by the adrenaline coursing through my system. I glanced up at the rearview mirror, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. Illuminated in the red glow of my taillights, I saw them. The 3 men had stopped chasing the car. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, completely still in the dead center of the dark road. Their long robes blew gently in the freezing wind, their blank, white faces staring blankly after my retreating car, looking eerily furious at the prey that had just slipped through their fingers. I kept my foot pinned to the floor. I didn't stop, I didn't slow down, and I didn't look back again. I must have been pushing 90 miles an hour as I tore blindly through the winding back roads, desperately navigating my way back to the safety of the interstate. The 20-minute drive felt like an eternity of hyperventilation and paranoid glances into my mirrors. When I finally pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of the pizza shop, I practically fell out of the car. I burst through the front doors, chest heaving, pale as a ghost, clutching my bleeding arm. The few coworkers who were still cleaning up froze, their casual chatter dying instantly as they took in my appearance. The look of utter shock and horror on their faces mirrored exactly how I felt. I stammered out the story, my voice shaking uncontrollably. My notoriously strict boss didn't say a word about the missing pizzas. He immediately reached for the phone and dialed 911. Within minutes, the police arrived at the shop, took my frantic statement, and dispatched multiple squad cars directly to the boarded-up house on the back road. I waited in the back room of the shop, shaking under a cheap blanket, while a paramedic bandaged my arm. Hours later, an officer returned to the shop to give us an update. His face was grim, his expression heavily guarded. When the police cruisers had arrived at the property, the masked men were long gone. The overgrown yard was empty, the driveway silent, but they had thoroughly searched the premises. They had gone into that decaying, rotting shed with the flickering light. The officer told us they didn't find anyone inside, but what they did find turned my blood completely to ice. Tucked away in the corners of that damp wooden room, the police discovered scattered drug paraphernalia. But that wasn't the worst part. Laid out deliberately across the floor, waiting in the sickly yellow light, they found heavy, thick coils of rope, an assortment of industrial zip ties, and a collection of crude, rusty torture equipment. They had been waiting for me. That isolated, dead-hour order wasn't a request for food. It was bait. They had lured me to the edge of the world, into the pitch-black silence of the dead hour, intending to drag me into that shed. If I had been just a second slower, if I had frozen instead of running, I would have never made it out of that driveway alive. I quit my job that very same night, and to this day, I refuse to drive down back roads after the sun goes down. The biting, unforgiving cold of a Chicago winter has a way of seeping deep into your bones. It chills your blood and transforms what should be a mundane, albeit annoying job into an outright grueling punishment. I work at a local, run-down pizza joint nestled deep within the city limits. It is the kind of establishment bathed entirely in the eternal, flickering hum of dying neon signs, always carrying that heavy, suffocating scent of baked dough, stale grease, and burnt pepperoni. I have the profoundly unfortunate, downright miserable responsibility of taking the delivery runs, and not the easy daytime corporate runs either. Thanks to a manager who actively and deliberately ignores my repeated requests for morning shifts, I am exclusively relegated to the weekend night shifts. These are the godforsaken hours when the city sheds its polite, bustling daytime mask, and the strange, the desperate, and the dangerous come crawling out from the woodwork to claim the streets. I always knew that driving around a major city at 2 a.m. with a pocket full of loose cash and a car smelling of food was a massive gamble. You hear the stories from the older drivers. Muggings, carjackings, violent setups in dead-end alleys. But you never actually believe the horrific urban legends will ever belong to you. You always assume you are the exception, not until the nightmare is standing right in front of you. It all started with the phone calls. There was this one specific customer who had slowly become somewhat of a dark, running legend among our night crew. He never ordered normally. The phone would ring, the caller ID would flash a local number, and when one of us answered, there would be no greeting. On the other end of the line, there would only be this heavy, wet, rhythmic breathing. Sometimes he would just hang up after 30 seconds of agonizing silence. Other times he would actually try to place an order, but his voice was completely detached from reality. He would make these bizarre, guttural, wet clicking sounds between his words, his tone shifting from a deadpan whisper to a frantic mumble. We all simply wrote him off. We thought he was just an idiot local teenager playing tired pranks with his friends, or perhaps an addict wandering the streets who had fried his brain a little too much. But then, the comments began. They escalated from mildly annoying to deeply, viscerally unsettling. I will never forget the night I was stuck manning the register. I answered the ringing phone and heard his raspy, hollow voice whisper directly into my ear through the receiver. He stated, very calmly, that he wanted to order a large pizza. I went through the standard motions and asked for his choice of toppings. He paused. The line went dead silent for a suffocating 3 seconds, the kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand straight up. Finally, he replied, "I want to order a large pizza with pineapples, mustard, and your skin." The way he said it paralyzed me. There was no laughter. There was no background giggling or muffled voices of friends putting him up to it. It was delivered with a flat, deadpan seriousness that made my stomach physically drop. After that night, we instituted a strict policy for his specific number. Whenever his information flashed on our digital display, we would either ignore the ringing entirely or pick up the receiver and immediately slam it back down. We assumed he would eventually get bored and that would be the end of our bizarre harassment. Fast forward a few agonizingly slow months. It was a bitterly cold Saturday night. The kind of desolate night where the freezing wind howling through the narrow alleyways sounds suspiciously like a dying animal crying out for help. The shop phone rang, shattering the quiet of the empty lobby. I glanced down at the glowing caller ID, and my blood ran just a fraction colder. It was him. Against my better judgment, and driven by a strange, morbid curiosity, I picked up the receiver, fully prepared to slam it down the very second I heard his raspy breathing. But I did not have to. Instead, a perfectly lucid, shockingly calm voice gave me a completely standard order. A large pepperoni pizza. No weird clicking sounds. No heavy, wet breathing. No horrific, violent topping requests. He simply gave the order, rattled off a local address, and waited for the total. My manager, desperate to make up for the lack of sales on such a slow night, bluntly told me to take the delivery. I would be entirely lying if I said I wasn't intrigued. After months of dealing with this phantom creep over the telephone lines, I was finally going to put a physical face to the haunting voice. I wanted to see exactly what kind of pathetic, lonely prankster had been trying to torment us from the safety of his living room. I grabbed the thick, insulated delivery bag, tossed it onto the passenger seat of my beat-up sedan, and pulled out into the desolate, frozen city streets. The address he had provided was incredibly strange. It was not situated in the bustling, densely populated heart of the city where 90% of our deliveries went. Instead, it was located right on the absolute, jagged edge of our delivery boundary. The drive took me further and further away from the comforting, artificial glow of streetlights and 24-hour convenience stores. The roads steadily grew narrower, the pavement becoming terribly cracked, neglected, and uneven. The modern apartment buildings and bright storefronts slowly gave way to decaying, forgotten architecture and empty, overgrown lots. The isolation was palpable, pressing down on the roof of my car like a physical weight. When my GPS finally chimed, announcing that I had arrived at my destination, I put the car in park and simply stared out through my frosted windshield. The house sitting ominously at the end of the overgrown dirt driveway looked like something violently ripped straight out of a gothic, black and white nightmare. It was a massive, looming, century-old structure that seemed to sag heavily under its own unnatural weight. The paint was peeling away from the wood in long, dead strips, resembling shedding skin in the moonlight. The windows were pitch black, reflecting absolutely nothing but the endless void of the night sky. There was not a single light on anywhere on the property. Not a welcoming porch light. Not a faint, flickering glow from a television illuminating the drawn blinds. There was just absolute, suffocating, impenetrable darkness. I sat inside my idling car for a long moment, the heater blasting desperately against the freezing air, feeling a primal, urgent knot of warning twisting violently in my gut. Every single evolutionary instinct I possessed was screaming at me to throw the car into reverse, crush the gas pedal, and speed blindly back to the neon lights of the pizza shop. But I stubbornly pushed the rising fear down. I forced myself to rationalize the situation. I told myself it was just an incredibly old, ugly house. It was just a weird guy wanting his late-night pizza. I wasn't terrified. I lied to myself, just extremely on edge. I killed the engine. The abrupt silence that immediately swallowed my car was absolutely deafening. I stepped out into the freezing, biting air. The sharp crunch of dead, frozen leaves beneath my heavy boots sounded obscenely loud in the quiet night. I grabbed the warm pizza bag and began the incredibly long, agonizing walk up the cracked, uneven stone pathway toward the rotting front porch. The long, distorted shadows cast by the skeletal, leafless trees seemed to reach out and grab at my jacket. Every single step I took felt heavier and more difficult than the last. As I slowly climbed the warping wooden steps to the dark porch, a sudden, immensely frustrating realization hit me like a physical blow. In my distraction and underlying, bubbling anxiety, I had completely forgotten to grab the man's 2-liter soda from the back seat of my car. I groaned inwardly, a wave of profound annoyance washing over my fear. Now, not only was I delivering food to the neighborhood lunatic in what looked like a haunted house, but I was going to have to stand in the freezing cold and deal with him complaining about a missing drink. I reached the massive, incredibly heavy oak front door and blindly searched for a doorbell in the gloom. I found a rusted metal button and pressed it hard, but I heard no familiar chime echo from within the house. It was completely dead. I raised my freezing knuckles and knocked hard against the solid wood. The sound echoed hollowly, instantly swallowed by the cavernous, silent house. I stood there on the porch, shifting my weight nervously from foot to foot, the brutal cold seeping entirely through my jeans. A full minute passed. Nothing happened. I heard no approaching footsteps. I saw no lights flickering on through the crack beneath the door. I knocked again, much louder and more aggressively this time, the sound violently piercing the dead silence of the neighborhood. Almost immediately after my second, aggressive knock, the heavy lock unlatched. The door did not open wide to welcome me. It merely cracked open a few scant inches, revealing a vertical slice of the pitch-black interior. And then, agonizingly slowly, it swung inward. The man standing in the dark doorway made the breath completely catch in my throat. He was incredibly tall, unsettlingly gaunt, and dressed in dark, filthy, ill-fitting clothes that hung lifelessly off his skeletal frame. But it was his face that entirely paralyzed me. He was wearing a mask, but it was not a normal, full-face Halloween mask. It was a bizarre, clinical-looking covering that stretched painfully tightly over his nose and mouth, concealing the entire lower half of his face. Above the dark material of the mask, his eyes were blown wide open, incredibly, impossibly wide. They were staring right through me, looking past my physical form. They did not blink. They just locked onto mine with an unhinged, predatory, and deeply unnatural intensity. For a terrifying second, my brain completely short-circuited. My ingrained customer service autopilot desperately kicked in, acting as a frantic defense mechanism against the absurd, waking nightmare standing just inches away from me. I cleared my throat awkwardly, my voice trembling noticeably as I announced the total price of the pizza. I quickly, almost breathlessly, added a desperate apology, explaining that I had accidentally left his soda in my vehicle and offered to run back and retrieve it, or deduct the cost from his total. He did not respond immediately. His unblinking, wide eyes slowly drifted down to the red pizza bag in my trembling hands. They lingered there for an agonizingly long, quiet moment, and then slowly dragged back up to meet my terrified gaze. "It's okay," he whispered softly. His voice was heavily muffled behind the thick material of the mask, but it was unmistakably the exact same raspy, dead-sounding, hollow voice from the terrifying phone calls. Then, total silence descended upon us once again. He just stood there in the doorway, staring. He made absolutely no move to reach into his pockets for a wallet. He made no motion to take the warm food from my hands. He was just watching me with those wide, unblinking, manic eyes. 5 agonizing seconds passed. Then 10. It felt like an eternity suspended entirely in ice. The tension suffocating the freezing air was so thick, it was physically hard to draw breath. My fear was rapidly, aggressively being replaced by a nervous, deeply defensive anger. I tightened my desperate grip on the handles of the bag, squared my shaking shoulders, and firmly, loudly repeated the total amount he owed me. He tilted his head slightly to the side, a slow, jerky, unnatural movement reminiscent of a bird observing an insect. "Okay," he whispered again into the cold air, and then he took a deliberate step closer to me. The smell radiating outward from the open, dark house was overwhelmingly metallic and intensely stale. He leaned in just a fraction toward my face and asked, in a completely calm, horrifyingly conversational tone, "Has anyone ever attacked you before?" My heart violently slammed against my ribs, threatening to crack the bone. Pure, unfiltered adrenaline flooded my veins. I swallowed hard, desperately trying to project a false confidence I absolutely did not possess. No, I lied, my voice dropping an octave to mask the terror. And if they tried, they would be incredibly sorry. He did not flinch. He did not back down or show a single ounce of intimidation. Instead, he slowly, methodically raised a pale, visibly trembling hand to the top edge of his strange mask. With agonizing, torturous slowness, he pulled the thick material down, finally exposing the lower half of his face to the moonlight. My stomach violently revolted. I do not know what I was expecting to see hidden away, but it was absolutely not the grotesque, horrifying canvas of mutilated flesh suddenly presented to me. Massive, incredibly deep, jagged scars radiated outward from the corners of his mouth, slicing violently up his pale cheeks in a permanent, horrific, unnatural smile. The surrounding skin was violently red and puckered, looking agonizingly tight against his skull. His actual lips were completely pale, deeply chapped and violently split in multiple places. It looked as though someone had taken a dull, rusted hunting knife directly to his face. He smiled at me then. It was a wide, stretching, monstrous smile that pulled violently at the rigid scar tissue, making it look as though the lower half of his face might rip entirely in half. He made no move to pay for the food. He just stood there in the freezing night, wearing that mutilated, terrifying grin, staring deeply into my terrified soul. The primal, desperate alarm bells ringing in my head were entirely deafening. I did not care about the pizza anymore. I did not care about my miserable job or the money. I only cared about surviving the night. "I'm leaving," I managed to choke out, my voice barely registering above a broken whisper. I did not wait for a single response. I spun around on my heels and practically threw my body down the rotting wooden stairs. I did not dare to look back. I just focused entirely on my car, the solitary beacon of safety resting in the oppressive, freezing dark. I had almost made it to the edge of the dirt driveway when the scream violently shattered the quiet night. It was not a yell of anger. It was not a frustrated shout. It was a blood-curdling, ear-piercing, unearthly scream of pure, unadulterated madness. It tore through the freezing air, vibrating physically in my chest and making my blood run entirely ice-cold. I threw a panicked, desperate glance over my shoulder, just in time to see him standing on the very edge of the porch. His arms were locked rigid at his sides, his scarred, ruined face tilted upward toward the dark sky, as that horrific, guttural sound poured relentlessly from his lungs. And then, with a violent, echoing crash that shook the trees, he slammed the massive oak door completely shut. The total silence that rushed back in to fill the void was almost as terrifying as the scream itself. I violently scrambled into my car, slammed the manual locks down, and peeled out of that driveway so aggressively I nearly threw the sedan into the ditch. I drove back to the city in a state of total, trembling shock, checking my rearview mirror every single 10 seconds, utterly terrified I would see his dark headlights tailing me through the empty streets. I walked directly into the brightly lit pizza shop, threw the now-cold pizza forcefully into the trash can, and bluntly told my manager I was completely done for the night. I do not care if I lose this miserable job. I am absolutely never, under any circumstances, taking a night delivery again. That man in the dark, that monster, he was never trying to be funny. None of it was a harmless prank. That final, unearthly scream he let out was the horrifying sound of something deeply, fundamentally, and irreparably broken. We immediately put his address and phone number on a permanent, strictly enforced blacklist. The pizza place where I worked was teetering, on the very edge of closing time. The neon open sign buzzing in the front window was the only source of life left in the building, casting a sickly, flickering red glow across the greasy linoleum floor. I was working the front counter entirely alone, thoroughly exhausted. The suffocating smell of baked dough, stale grease, and burned cheese had seeped so deeply into my uniform that I could taste it. My eyes kept darting to the clock on the wall, watching the second hand drag itself toward the end of my shift. I was just tying off the last garbage bag, my mind already drifting to the comfort of my own bed, when the jarring ring of the telephone shattered the quiet. I froze, letting out a heavy, frustrated sigh. We were minutes away from locking the doors. Reluctantly, I wiped my hands on my apron and lifted the receiver. reciting my usual tired greeting. But there was no answer. There was only a hollow, cavernous silence on the other end of the line. It wasn't the sound of a dead connection, but the heavy, expectant silence of an open line where someone is simply refusing to speak. A faint trace of static hummed against my ear. Unsettled, I hung up the phone, shaking my head and muttering about prank callers under my breath. I went back to tying off the trash. Exactly 1 minute later, the phone rang again. The sound felt infinitely louder this time, almost aggressive in the empty shop. I snatched the receiver up, my irritation mounting, and barked out a greeting. Once again, nothing but that vast, empty silence greeted me. I was just pulling the phone away from my ear, ready to slam it down onto the receiver, when a voice finally broke through the static. It was the voice of an old woman, but it sounded unspeakably fragile, as though the effort of speaking was draining the very last reserves of her life. It was a weak, trembling whisper, impossibly cold and entirely devoid of emotion. She asked for a regular pie to be delivered. I maintained a veneer of practiced customer service, mechanically taking down her order and address while every nerve in my body screamed in protest. I just wanted to flip the neon sign to closed, lock the doors, and escape into the night. But duty, and a desperate need for my meager paycheck, bound me. I called out to my boss in the back kitchen, informing him that a late-night delivery had just come through. From the depths of the kitchen, he yelled back that I had to take it. A wave of bitter frustration washed over me. But as I stood there, staring at the scribbled address on the notepad, I tried to rationalize the situation. It was just one more run. One more tip. And in my experience, the elderly customers usually tip the best, often handing over a crumpled $20 bill and telling me to keep the change. I decided I could endure one final trip. I returned to the phone to tell the woman her total and assure her the food would be arriving shortly. But the line was already dead. She had hung up without another word. I thought her abruptness was incredibly rude, perhaps just the eccentricity of an isolated old woman, so I pushed the unease to the back of my mind. I yelled to the chef to throw one last regular pie into the oven. My boss emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a towel, and told me that I should just head straight home after making the drop. The shop would be locked up and dark by the time I finished. It was just a few minutes before 10 o'clock when I finally grabbed the cardboard box, its heat seeping through the bottom, and walked out into the cool night air. I climbed into my car, the leather seats cold against my back, and punched the address into my GPS. The destination was 7 miles away, situated deep within the quietest, most forgotten side of town. The drive itself felt like a slow descent into isolation. As I followed the glowing blue line on my navigation screen, the familiar, brightly lit streets of the commercial district began to fall away, replaced by narrow, winding roads and looming silhouettes of overgrown trees. The streetlights grew sparse, their sickly yellow beams barely piercing the thick darkness. The deeper I drove into the neighborhood, the more profound the silence became. There were no other cars on the road, no pedestrians walking their dogs, no distant hum of highway traffic. It felt as though the entire world had been swallowed up by the night, leaving only me and the glowing dashboard of my car. I finally pulled onto her street. The GPS announced my arrival in a cheerful, synthetic voice that felt violently out of place in the suffocating quiet. I parked at the curb and killed the engine. The house sat on a vast, empty block, a small, solitary one-story structure that looked entirely abandoned. There wasn't a single light burning inside. The windows were pitch black, reflecting nothing but the dark canopy of trees surrounding the property. The lawn was overgrown, the shadows stretching long and distorted across the dying grass. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, the warm smell of the pizza filling the cabin, warring with the sudden icy dread pooling in my stomach. I desperately hoped I had written the address down wrong. I hoped this was just a mistake, a mix-up, and I could turn the car around and go home. But the numbers on the mailbox matched the notepad perfectly. Taking a deep, unsteady breath, I grabbed the pizza box and stepped out of the vehicle. The cool night air hit me immediately, carrying a strange metallic scent. My footsteps seemed deafeningly loud as I walked up the cracked concrete path toward the front porch. I climbed the 3 wooden steps, feeling them groan slightly beneath my weight, and pressed the doorbell. Nothing happened. No chime echoed from deep within the house. No dogs barked. No floorboards creaked. I stood there in the suffocating darkness, shifting my weight from foot to foot, the heat of the pizza box slowly fading against my chest. After a torturously long minute, I reached out and rang the bell again. pressing it harder this time. Still, the house offered nothing but a dead, impenetrable silence. I was entirely ready to give up. I had done my job. I had made the trip. If she didn't want to answer the door, that wasn't my problem. I turned my body, preparing to walk back down the steps and retreat to the safety of my car, when a sudden prickle of electricity washed over my skin. The primal, undeniable sensation of being watched. Slowly, I turned my head back toward the house. There, standing behind the dirty glass of the large front window, was a figure. My breath caught in my throat, and I took an involuntary step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the porch. The sudden appearance of a silhouette in a pitch-black house sent a surge of pure adrenaline straight to my heart. I stood frozen for a few seconds, my eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom, before curiosity and an overwhelming sense of obligation forced me to inch closer to the glass. It was the old woman. She looked to be in her late 70s, her thin, wispy white hair hanging limply around her pale face. She was standing perfectly still, her hands resting at her sides, framed by the darkness of the room behind her. But it was her face that made my blood run cold. She was staring directly at me, her eyes wide and unblinking, with an expression so entirely blank and devoid of humanity that she looked like a mannequin. There was no recognition, no annoyance, no life in her gaze. Just an empty, hollow stare. My voice trembled as I raised a hand, awkwardly gesturing to the cardboard box. I yelled through the thick glass, telling her I had her pizza, hoping to break the unnatural trance she seemed to be in. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She didn't acknowledge my words in any way. Panic began to bubble up in my chest. I raised my voice louder, practically screaming through the window, my words echoing uselessly into the quiet night, pleading with her to just open the door so I could leave. And then, very slowly, a smile began to spread across her face. It was not a pleasant smile. It wasn't the warm, genuine expression of an elderly woman happy to see her food. It was a horrifying, mechanical stretching of the skin. Her lips pulled back far too wide, revealing teeth that looked too large for her mouth, stretching her wrinkled face into a grotesque mask of pure malice. The smile did not reach her dead, unblinking eyes. It was an expression that belonged on a corpse, a deeply unnatural contortion that sent absolute, paralyzing chills violently cascading down my spine. I will never, for as long as I live, forget the exact, nightmarish face she made at me through that dirty glass. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I didn't wait for her to move. I didn't say another word. I practically threw myself backward off the porch, stumbling over the cracked pathway as I sprinted desperately toward my car. I yanked the driver's side door open, threw the pizza box haphazardly onto the passenger seat, and slammed the door shut, instantly hitting the lock button. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely breathe. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling uncontrollably over the screen, and rapidly typed out a frantic, misspelled text to my boss, telling him the delivery was a failure, that something was terribly wrong, and I was leaving. I shoved the phone into my pocket and grabbed my keys, jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, the loudest and most comforting sound I had ever heard. I gripped the steering wheel, preparing to slam my foot on the gas and get the hell away from this cursed street. Before shifting into drive, a morbid, terrifying curiosity forced me to look to my right. I needed to know she was still trapped behind the glass. I needed to know I was safe. I turned my head toward the passenger window. She was standing right there. Less than an inch of glass separated her face from mine. She was standing outside my car, in the darkness, leaning down to peer directly into the passenger window. Her hands were pressed flat against the glass, leaving greasy streaks. And she was giving me that exact same dead, unblinking stare, her lips still stretched back into that impossible, horrifying, ear-to-ear smile. She hadn't made a sound. She hadn't opened the front door. It was physically impossible for her to have moved from the window of the house to my car. In the handful of seconds it took me to run down the path. Yet, there she was, waiting for me. A guttural sound of pure terror ripped itself from my throat. I slammed the shifter into drive and stomped the accelerator directly to the floorboards. The tires squealed furiously against the asphalt, fighting for traction before violently propelling the car forward. I tore down the dark, empty street, my hands locked onto the steering wheel in a death grip, my eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't look back at the solitary, unlit house fading into the night. I didn't stop driving until I was back under the harsh, comforting glow of the city streetlights. I never found out who or what that woman was, or how she moved so silently and swiftly in the dark. But when I finally returned to work the next afternoon, pale and completely shaken, my boss took one look at my face and made a silent agreement with me. He never ever forced me to do a late-night delivery again. The clock on the diner wall read 1 in the morning, and I was beyond exhausted. I was just another college student trading my sleep for minimum wage at a rundown pizza shop that felt like it was dying as fast as my patience. I had just flipped the neon open sign to dark and started wiping down the grease-stained counter, desperate to grab my backpack and vanish into the night. Then the phone rang. The sound echoed through the hollow kitchen like a gunshot. I stared at the receiver, every instinct telling me to let it ring out, but a sense of duty, or maybe just the fear of my manager, made me pick it up. On the other end, a man's voice crawled through the line. It was impossibly low, distorted and slow, like he was speaking through a throat full of wet gravel. He wanted 4 large pizzas. I hesitated. The ovens were already cooling, and the air was settling into that heavy post-shift silence. But he insisted, and 4 large pizzas meant a tip that could actually help me cover rent. Against my better judgment, I told him I'd be there. 30 minutes later, I was on my motorcycle, cutting through an unforgiving chill. The address was wrong, not just hard to find, but wrong. It sat on the extreme outskirts of the city, well beyond the comforting amber glow of the streetlights. As I rode, the paved roads dissolved into jagged dirt trails. Ancient, skeletal trees rose on either side, their branches intertwining above me until they choked out the moonlight. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the weak, flickering beam of my headlight cutting through a mist so thick I could almost taste it. There was a suffocating stillness out there. No crickets, no wind. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for me to trip. After an eternity in that labyrinth, I saw it. My headlight washed over a structure that made my blood turn to ice. It was a decaying house, being swallowed whole by the forest. The paint had peeled away like dead skin, the porch sagged under the weight of rot, and the windows were pitch black, hollow eyes staring back at me. There wasn't a single light or sign of life. It looked like it hadn't seen a living soul in decades. I pulled over, my hands shaking so hard I could barely grip the handlebars. I dialed my manager. I wanted to tell him the address was a mistake, that I was coming back. It went straight to voicemail. I knew his temper. If I returned with 4 cold, unpaid pizzas, he'd take it out of my paycheck. I couldn't afford the loss. I swallowed the bile in my throat, grabbed the insulated bags, and stepped off the bike. The moment my boots hit the overgrown weeds, a single, sickly yellow light flickered on deep inside the house. It didn't feel like a welcome. It felt like a lure. I forced myself onto the rotting porch, the wood groaning under my weight. I pressed the bell. Nothing. I called out, my voice sounding thin and pathetic against the vast emptiness of the woods. I waited in the biting cold, then pressed it again. From deep within the bowels of the house, I heard it. Heavy, deliberate pacing. Someone was coming to the door. I waited for the turn of a lock, but the door stayed shut. I stood there for a full minute, my heart hammering against my ribs. I decided I'd done enough. I turned to leave, but as I pivoted, the front door creaked open on its own. It revealed a dark, yawning hallway that smelled of mildew and old earth. Panic screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed by the thought of that missing money. I stepped over the threshold, calling out a tentative greeting into the dim corridor. Suddenly, a blur of motion darted from beneath a moth-eaten sofa, a scrawny black cat. It bolted toward a room at the end of the hall. The second it crossed the doorway, a light snapped on inside, followed instantly by the deafening static of a television set. Then came the giggling, high-pitched, mocking laughter of children. Anger briefly spiked through my fear. I figured this was some sick prank. I marched down the hall and stepped into the room. Sitting rigidly on the edge of a stained bed were 2 little girls. They wore faded nightgowns, their faces pale and completely expressionless. They weren't looking at the TV. They were staring unblinkingly at me. I demanded to know where their parents were, my voice cracking as I explained I needed to be paid. They didn't move. They didn't blink. The temperature in the room plummeted until I could see my own breath. Then, their eyes began to change. Their pupils rolled back, dissolving into a terrifying, milky white. Their stoic faces twisted into wide, unnatural grins, and that giggling turned into a guttural, demonic roar. In perfect sync, they raised their pale arms and pointed their fingers at the doorway directly behind me. A paralyzing chill swept over me. I slowly turned my head. Standing in the doorway, completely blocking my exit, was the towering, nightmarish shadow of a woman. I couldn't see her face, but the malice radiating from her was physical. The pizza boxes slipped from my numb fingers, hitting the floor with a dull sound. Survival instinct finally won. I lunged past the apparition, scrambling down the hall and bursting out into the freezing night. I sprinted to my motorcycle, the demonic laughter echoing through the trees behind me. I kicked the engine to life and tore down the dirt path. As I glanced back, I saw the woman and the two girls standing in the doorway, silently watching me disappear into the dark. I pushed the bike as fast as I dared, desperate for the main road. But then, the engine violently shuddered and died. I coasted to a halt in the pitch-black woods. I checked the tires. The rear one was completely flat. Shaking violently, I fumbled for my phone and dialed the police, sobbing as I begged them to find me. As I waited in the oppressive silence, my eyes drifted to the rearview mirror. My heart stopped. Standing directly behind me, illuminated by the faint moonlight, were the woman and the two girls. They weren't walking. They were gliding toward me. I abandoned the bike and fled blindly into the brush. Branches tore at my skin as I ran until my lungs burned. I collapsed behind the trunk of an ancient oak, curling into a ball and praying. Hours seemed to pass before the beautiful, distant wail of a siren pierced the air. I staggered back to the road. A patrol car was there, its red and blue lights washing over the trees. I rushed the officers, babbling about the shadows and the house. They drove me back to that decaying ruin and searched it with their weapons drawn. They found nothing. No pizzas, no woman, no girls. Just the scrawny black cat sitting in the corner of a dusty, empty room. The next morning, an officer called me. He told me the house had been vacant for 3 years. The last people to live there, a mother and her 2 daughters, had been brutally murdered in that very living room. The case was never solved,